Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I am Emma Joyce, Head of Community at Global Digital Finance, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this Global Leaders Town Hall in partnership with Global Blockchain Business Council, with special guest Richard Teng, CEO of the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, ADGM. Lawrence Wintermeyer, Executive Co-Chair of GDF and GBBC UK Regional Ambassador, will host this town hall and ask Richard about the current health crisis that is creating an economic crisis and a humanitarian crisis, how governments and central banks are responding to the crisis, as well as looking at the situation on the ground in the UAE. Richard Teng is the Chief Executive Officer of the Financial Services Regulatory Authority, an internationally recognized and award-winning financial center within Abu Dhabi global market. Since joining in March 2015, Richard has spearheaded the establishment of the financial center, leading up to the successful launch of ADGM in October 2015. As CEO, Richard has oversight over the entire spectrum of financial services within ADGM, spanning banking, insurance, and capital market sectors, with integrated prudential and conduct supervisory responsibilities. To support the growth of ADGM as an international financial centre, Richard also leads ecosystem initiatives and the strategic development of financial services offerings. In the short span since its launch, ADGM has been awarded Financial Centre of the Year, MENA, for 3 consecutive years in 2016, 17 and 18 by Euromoney's Global Investors Group. In 2018, ADGM was named Fintech Regulator of the Year, MENA, by Seamless Middle East, lending further endorsement to ADGM's international standing as a progressive regulator. Today, ADGM is the fastest growing asset management hub and financial centre in MENA and recognised as the top regional REIT management hub. Among its many firsts, ADGM introduced the first private REIT regime, the first comprehensive regulatory framework to govern crypto exchanges and ICO issuances, as well as the first regulatory fintech sandbox in the region, second most active globally. To transform the capital formation landscape in MENA, ADGM has partnered with the Shanghai Stock Exchange to develop a Belt and Road Exchange in ADGM. With more than 2 decades of regulatory leadership and financial sector development experience, Richard is featured frequently on international forums, sharing thought leadership on areas such as fintech regulations and Belt and Road developments. Prior to taking up the leadership of SRA in March 2015, he was the Chief Regulatory Officer of Singapore Exchange and previously held appointments as Director of Corporate Finance, Monetary Authority of Singapore. Richard holds a Master's distinction in Applied Finance from the University of Western Sydney, Australia, and graduated with first-class honours in accountancy from the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. We welcome and encourage your questions. If you have a question, please feel free to submit them at any time using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. I hope you enjoyed today's session, and I'd now like to welcome Lawrence and Richard.
Well, thank you very much, Emma. Welcome to all of our listeners. And yes, I think what a privilege it is for us to have you today on a Leader series, Richard Teng. And what a few years you've had at ADGM. Really the fintech hub in MENA. I thought we'd start off by looking at the current COVID-19 situation. And Richard, can you give us a view of what's going on in the ground, in the UAE, but maybe as well put the UAE into a geographic perspective? I'm often confused exactly what is in and what is not in the Emirates. But if you could give us a view of that, that'd be super to kick things off.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Lawrence. It's always a pleasure working alongside you on this front. So let me just start by, I think you asked a very important question. What is the UAE? It comprises of 7 emirates. It was founded, came together in 1971. So it includes Abu Dhabi, which is the capital, which I'm located. Abu Dhabi Global Market is the international financial center, really supporting Abu Dhabi in its global aspiration to develop its financial services sector that supports the various engines of the real economy. We have other emirates, Dubai. I think many in the Western economies would know Dubai very well as well. And other Emirates, Ras Al Khaimah, Sharjah, and the list goes on. So it is a federation of 7 different Emirates coming together to form a country. So I think that, to start off with, is the premise of where we are in UAE. Similar to the rest of the world, in terms of geography, we really view ourselves as a hub, very much like London, UK is a hub for Europe. We view ourselves as a hub for the Middle East, South Asia, Africa region, right? It has extremely high standard of living, high standard of healthcare, education, great quality of life. International expatriates can come in freely. There are no restrictions on those fronts. The taxation is something to really be envied, especially in the Western economies, right? So personal taxation is at 0%. That is that's a luxury that for many of us here, we take comfort in that. So it is a huge attraction to many talent globally to hub themselves here. About 80% to 85% of the population are from international community. People like myself, different stakeholders from talent from different parts of the world, anchoring themselves here to support the growth of this region. So I think that is a very brief introduction. And then let me move very quickly to, I think you asked a question about COVID. I think we are not spared, as with the rest of the world. We are handling the situation. There is an outbreak situation very much like the rest of the world. There are things put in place in terms of movement control to try to curb the spread of the virus, trying to make sure that in terms of cases is plateauing. So those efforts are ongoing. The government has spent great efforts and resources on that, including trying to disinfect every day, be it in terms of workplace or public spaces at night. So great efforts has been put in from both a healthcare front. If you look at the number of testing that's being conducted here, I believe on a per capita basis is the highest among the different parts of the world globally. So the government take it very, very seriously, right? Particularly both the UAE as well as the Abu Dhabi government. But at the same time, recognizing, sorry.
Richard, I was just going to ask if the central bank and the central banks have coordinated their efforts in the region.
I do think that as of now, the central bank are speaking to each other, but in terms of real coordination, I do still believe that it's a country by country effort, right? So I believe there's a conversation about what else can we do together. In country, we are always talking about better collaboration, about supporting each other, and we have several efforts on that front. But if you look at the impact to the economy, it's quite devastating, especially to the small and medium enterprises, right? So the government has spent quite a lot of effort, especially all the regional governments as well as the local governments, right? Along 4 different fronts, 4 different measures. Firstly, trying to help the SMEs in particular conserve cash, right? So there are measures on those fronts. We can go into details later. There are measures to give the SME greater liquidity, greater funding, greater credit to make sure that they survive this crisis, especially in the next few months. That's extremely important. The third is in terms of labor, right? How do you allow for freer labor or flexibility in terms of labor structure, which some economies may not have that. And the fourth, structural policies of the government favoring the SME. So we do see different measures being put in place by the governments. We are coordinating efforts on things like cyber risk. We see an escalation of cyber attacks during this particular crisis. So the different governments, agencies are coordinating on that front. On the AML KYC front, how do you do e-onboarding of customers, of corporates that need the funding, right? All those areas of cooperation on those fronts.
And I was wondering if there are specific areas of the economy in the UAE that have been particularly hurt. The global story is around travel, leisure, entertainment. If you look in the US, even the sports franchises now have I think stopped all operations probably towards the end of the year into next year. And the UAE does have a large number of expats, or relies on a large number of expats for its workforce. And I think what we have noted is that particularly in the SMEs, right down to the mom and pop shops of the micro enterprises, that one of the difficult things with either the US CARES Act, payroll protection, or going right to the UK and C bills, that it's not always easy to get money to those smaller, medium-sized businesses. But has there been one particular area in the UAE that's been vulnerable to COVID-19?
UAE itself is a very open economy. As with all open economy, the impact is even worse, right? So if you look at the various sectors that you mentioned just now, aviation is a big sector for UAE. Hospitality, travel and tourism are big sectors. Trade and commerce, global trade flows that have been impacted. Logistics is another big area for the UAE. So all these are impacted, right? Restaurants will not go back to normal, even with the lockdown easing and reopening, because there are movement controls, there are capacity constraints coming into play. So there are impacts on the economy in various instances. And if you look at, you raised the issue of SMEs, they are the most vulnerable, right? Yeah. So if you look at different surveys and research, in the States, most of the SME hold slightly more than half a month of cash buffer. In China, that figure is closer to 2 to 3 months. But regardless of what figure you're talking about, most of the SMEs don't hold more than 6 months of cash buffer, right? And their cost structure is such that you probably have a very high fixed cost in terms of rental, right? You probably have pretty high fixed costs in terms of labor as well. And you can't lay off like the big enterprises because you only have that few workers. If you lay off, it's going to be quite impactful who's going to do the work, for instance, right? So they tend to come out much worse off. They tend to be much more vulnerable in a shock event like this.
Well, indeed, and a number of initiatives that we've been involved with in global digital finance have started to focus on how we can get money to people quicker, whether it's citizens or SMEs, but recognizing that SMEs are at the vulnerable end of the economy. And I think, broadly, the digital dollar is the category in the US, representing something between a stable coin or a CBDC. But there were earlier provisions in the CARES Act for at least thinking about whether or not there were mechanisms for us to get money in the US quicker to those communities, without going through the process of issuing checks. Has there been a similar discussion going on in Abu Dhabi, anywhere around ADGM, about how the role of digital assets or digital cash might play in getting money to citizens or small businesses any quicker?
I do think that conversation is happening throughout the world, not in the exact sense, right? So in UAE, in ADGM, I think the key focus for the enterprises here is, firstly, how do we help them to preserve cash, right? To tide them over this situation. And that comes in various forms, right? Rental rebates in terms of electricity, different type of tariff rebates, offsets. For us, waiving things like half of supervision fee that our financial institutions pay. That is trying to conserve cash as much as possible. So that's one area of measures that we have put in place quite extensively. The second area is trying to get cash and funding and credit into the hands of the SME, right? Very similar to what you see globally. In the UK, you have the UK Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan. In the US, you have your PPP, right? Similarly, here, central bank has come out to make sure that, look, reserve requirements for banks have been reduced from 14 to 7% to allow for much more lending to take place. There's a 50 billion interest-free loan that's put in place for the banks and financial institutions that extend that. There are things like trying to get financial institutions to open SME account within 2 days,
wow,
provided all documentation are in place. Because like you say, it's important to get cash to them quickly, right, as and when they need it. The government policies, I mentioned structural policies, government policies are changing as well. In terms of procurement policies, certain amount will go to SMEs to make sure that, look, they are taken care of in terms of supplies from the governments, etc. But payment are made on a much more expedited basis to the SME as well, to make sure that you give cash, put cash into their hand. Right? The other area I mentioned briefly is about labor structure. You're allowing the employer and employee to negotiate on unpaid leave, for instance, on possible wage restructuring, to try to preserve jobs as much as possible and to inject certain flexibility within the labor structure.
Can we finish with one question around COVID-19 and the coronavirus, and then move on to some of the other things that you're doing? But many of the governments in the world now are starting to focus on what they've been calling exit strategies, and focusing on a near semblance of trying to get things back up and running. What is the exit strategy that you're seeing emerge in Abu Dhabi or across the UAE, some of the themes, and do you have a view about how long this extended crisis is really going to go on?
I don't have a crystal ball in that sense. I'm not quite sure how long. I think your guess is as good as mine. But I do think before I move to this, I want to just touch on a very brief point that about fintechs, right? You mentioned is digital adoption coming into play? We do see that the financial institutions will need to adopt digital in a much more aggressive sense. So just to finish up the conversation we have just now, because this crisis really show up the shortcomings in many different areas. If you look at what's happening in the States, right? The PPP program, 350 billion given to SMEs of less than 500 employees, right? But if you only allow the traditional financial institutions to hand out those, there's a tendency for them to only give it to their existing customers, right? Because they are not geared up for digital onboarding. They are not geared up to process large amount of data. In this lockdown situation, they can't do a lot of things. As a result, a fiasco resulted, right? Because a lot of those money goes to companies that are listed that don't need those money and doesn't go into the needy, so to say, right? Because they are not geared up to that front. So globally, including here, we are seeing a much faster move towards digital adoption on that front. Financial institutions are trying to gear up instead of relying on in-house solution, really working with the fintechs of the world to allow them to put money much quicker into the hands of stakeholders. So coming to the exit issue that I think you have raised, I do believe that the game plan, we are seeing it coming into play now, is safe distancing will be the norm. It will change the way we work, we consume, we operate and interact going forward. There are still issues with movement control. Offices and malls are operating at 30% capacity, and so are restaurants. So all these are longer, at least short-term impact until we see a vaccine being developed. The air travel that we're used to, and we used to travel very often, Lawrence, will be totally different, right? Are you going to keep the middle seat empty going forward? And that changed the entire business model for airplanes. Co-working space will be quite different. Hot desking will be quite different. The gig economy, are you going to share a ride with somebody? If you look at what happened in China after they reopened the economy, people rush out to buy their own cars. People rush out to buy their own bicycles, etc. Right? Because the way to commute in a safe way is going to be quite different.
Yes, indeed. And I'm delighted you picked up the point that fintechs have to play, the role that they have to play in COVID-19. I think it's fair to say from the observations, my own observations, that having spent a decade in the fintech community where we originally met, building fintechs to service customers and small, medium-sized enterprises that the banks either didn't or couldn't serve after the financial crisis in order to really maintain their own capital adequacy, you know, all sorts of other reasons. We're now not relying, I think, in many countries on the fintechs at all. So a lot of the schemes that were announced, government went directly to the larger banks. And I think it's good that you've raised that point, because we're seeing some sort of moves beyond that now, an extension of schemes. But just to give us a sense of things again, in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, have you seen fintechs stepping up and administering or participating in any of the programs to get money to businesses quicker?
Not in that sense, but the fintechs are really, as I mentioned, are really working alongside with the financial institutions to allow for much faster onboarding, loan automation, eKYC, artificial intelligence, different way of credit analytics in that sense. But in themselves, working through in terms of giving out the loans, not really. They are still working, but the fintechs are working alongside the financial institutions.
Yes, and I think, you know, this is a very good point that will probably continue to pick up through the crisis and look at after the crisis. But I think from my perspective, certainly in the US, the UK, and some parts of Europe, we've put a great fintech capability in to service, you know, microfinance, small, medium-sized clients, and it has been difficult to get government funding, and you know those are the non-banks that are best positioned to actually serve those segments anyway. So absolutely, you brought that point up, Richard. I just wanted to turn on to you know, a mutual interest point, which is around crypto or digital assets, and you were lauded you know, early for your progressive framework. I've noted now that Abu Dhabi is really becoming a focal point for the crypto community, particularly for licensing. Huobi, which is one of the top 10 exchanges or VASPs, and a GDF, a Global Digital Finance Patron member, is in licensing process. Kraken's on record for, you know, establishing or communicating that they're seeking to establish a license. So can you walk us through what it is about Abu Dhabi that you think is really attractive to these global large VASPs and exchanges, and why they're looking at the region?
So we didn't set out to be a global leader in that space, Lawrence. We set out to come up with smart, sensible rules and regulations to really support the growth of that sector. In our view, if you look at the entire digital asset space, the entire tokenization space, we do think there's plenty of growth. But to allow them to grow in a sustainable fashion, we do think that you need proper regulations that form the foundation for sustainable growth. And that's how that conversation started, with a lot, initially with the crypto assets and the virtual asset players that come our way. And subsequently, when they highlighted all this risk to us, we started the conversation with different stakeholders globally, be it fellow regulators on the one hand, with institutional investors on the other, and other investors, right? Because you have to make sure that, look, the rules and regulations that's coming forth make sense, but also address the risks of these various stakeholders, right? And every time the risks are not properly addressed, where virtual assets are being lost and stolen by the billion, it doesn't instill confidence into the asset class. If you don't instill confidence into the asset class, the institutional investors don't partake. And they form a critical part of the liquidity and volume for that asset class. So that's how we formulate. I had an earlier webinar on this issue 2 hours ago. And we say that, look, we came out with, by and large, one of the most comprehensive digital asset exchange regime globally. And we are ahead of our time in terms of we built things like FATF travel rules into our regime, really because we think that the only way to go to get international acceptance, to get credibility among global regulators and global financial community, is to make sure that we build in the rules that address the risk and allow the fintech to continue to grow in a sustainable fashion, bring in the institutional investors. And I think we are, by and large, proven right on that front. When you address risk of custody, AML, KYC, investor protection, exchange operation, you wipe out all the wash trades and the fake volume, etc. That gave investors confidence. That stamp of approval gave investor confidence, and also give fellow regulators elsewhere confidence to say that, look, these are credible players. The exchanges that we're dealing with are credible, and we're happy for our banks to be dealing with them, for instance. So that is really what happened.
So I love that you unintentionally, by setting up a gold standard for crypto regulation that's attracted VASPs, that you've got a lot of the global VASPs now going there. But again, I think the key thing is the credibility and the legitimacy of being in the system, open to private and institutional markets, and open to greater pools of liquidity to be able to operate legitimately within the system, which is the biggest incentive. I think that's probably one of the biggest trends that we've seen with a lot of the larger exchanges, and then particularly since the FATF travel rule. I mean, you've brought up the FATF travel rule. And can you give us an indication, is Abu Dhabi, and are you and the regulator on track for implementing that in 2020?
I think different jurisdictions are at different stages. I do think that with global standards, now that we are working through all the messaging standards on what information to include in terms of original and beneficiary, we are working with the industry on that front very closely. In fact, all the exchange that comes through us and that we have approved have that inbuilt feature in terms of their system to comply with that. So we're quite confident there are solutions out there to assure compliance. But going back to the point, not every digital asset players agree to a much higher standard, right? There are short-term players. There are players in the short haul that think that, lax standards and regulatory arbitrage, at least in the next 1 or 2 years, is good. But then if you're a serious player, and I think we have every intention to attract the serious player, you want to build a sustainable business, sustainable model. You want to protect your stakeholders. You want to do good for your shareholders. I do think that you need to address all the different risks that I mentioned.
And just coming back to the federal, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, in the simplest explanation, I describe it as a two-track world, one where larger VASPs are focused on regulated environments. And again, I think it's in everyone's interest to unlock liquidity, unlock access to be able to access everything from retail customers to private markets. This is actually how markets do grow. So, the probability of having a two-track or a sort of two-world system is emerging. But hopefully, most of the legitimate players will be attracted to the larger liquid markets. But I think in the context of FATF and the travel rule, we've supported working with a number of other members associations in GDF, the Chamber of Digital Commerce, ADAXA, the establishment of something called an inter-VASP messaging standard, so that we've got at least some level of standard at the VASP messaging level, which we're hoping that the technical service providers and VASPs pick up and adopt. But do you think that any of this might get delayed at all this year because of COVID, or are we going to have a multi-track implementation of FATF as different authorities like yourself or different regulators in the country look at and apprise how difficult it is to get things in? Or do you think that we'll have reasonably coordinated effort to get to the implementation of the travel rule?
My view is you have to study jurisdiction by jurisdiction, right? And I don't think you're going to have uniform implementation at a certain date. I don't think that's going to come about, right? So I think the more developed jurisdiction, those that are much more ready to push through, be it because of technical standards or they understand this much better, or they are much more serious in terms of pushing through the agenda, those will implement it first. And we have seen different jurisdictions, US, UK, Japan, the likes ourselves, pushing on those agendas, Singapore again, pushing on those agendas. So you're going to see a few jurisdictions pushing ahead with this. It's going to get much greater acceptance globally as the rest put in place what is needed in their own jurisdiction to have that in place. But over time, right? Again, we can agree to speculate on the timing issue, how long it will take. But over time, you gravitate to
Oh, hi, Emma. I'm reaching out to you for some help here. Have we lost the video connection?
It looks as though we have lost Richard, but he's back.
Okay, Richard, sorry, we just lost you. We just lost you for a minute.
oh, you're all right. Technical issue, I guess.
Yes, and indeed. Well, we do so many of these things. They're always stopping and starting up. Everybody's entirely patient with that. Do we move on a bit further and talk about a bit about the digital lab? I mean, the last time that you and I were at a proper conference was the UN General Assembly, I think, in the autumn of 2018.
Yes.
And you were talking about plans for, at that time, a digital sandbox, moving on from regulatory sandbox models. And so I'm just going to read this because I love this description for your digital lab, which is a virtual environment hosted by ADGM, where fintechs, financial institutions, and regulators, particularly the FSRA, can seamlessly connect, experiment, and develop innovative solutions, creating new products and testing prototypes swiftly. And it's a subject close to my own heart, having chaired the FCA industry sandbox consultation years back when we were all thinking about industry and regulatory sandboxes. But could you give us an idea of what the real driver for that was, and if there are 2 or 3 big use cases? And again, Anna Wallace at the FCA was the first person I ever heard use the term wicked problems, which I liked because it put industry into a context, and it said, look, we could probably solve a ton of things, but unless we solve these 2 or 3 big things, we're not going to make any progress. So, again, what was the drive for the digital lab, and are there 2 or 3 use cases that you're particularly focused on?
It really goes back to our experience with regulatory sandbox, right? So in our view, digital lab is regulatory sandbox 2.0. It's hosted in a digital environment. So we have some success with our regulatory sandbox. We host players globally, not only local players, but globally that think that their products and services, especially on the fintech front, is suitable for deployment into this region. And we are perfect incubators, we are perfect test bed on that front for them to work very close alongside with a regulator to understand the rules and regulation, the norms, working alongside financial institutions, other ecosystem players within this economy on that front. And we got a lot of insight upfront, right? As regulators, we then have a much better appreciation and understanding of the risks of the different business model, and we gain confidence from there. And we start to think, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we can translate everything that currently is in a physical environment, you need to be here, you need to do testing within certain parameters, into a digital format, right? And in that digital format, first, it'll be a marketplace where we allow financial institutions in Abu Dhabi, in UAE, and from the region to come into the marketplace to work alongside global fintech players that have great products and offerings, to innovate, to experiment, to do POC on a very quick basis, hosted on a cloud environment with data available for testing, with regulators like ourselves standing in between to make sure there's proper oversight, proper guidance, Wouldn't that be a very cool idea to really foster the growth of different areas? It short-circuit quite a number of things, including if you look at in the region that we are in, API is a problem, right? So if it's properly API enabled and enable all these players to connect quite quickly, the procurement process, as with all fintechs will tell you that the procurement process of financial institutions are huge pain, right? So you can have an environment where the financial institutions come into this environment, look at the product, test the product, see how it can assimilate back into the organization while they are going through their own procurement process. It will short circuit the deployment of all the product and services, right? That's pretty cool as well, right? So there are multiple benefits, not only for stakeholders, but for global regulators while we walk through, right? You asked about things that we are trying to do. So one of the things that we're working with 2 other regulators as of now is tokenization, compliance token. When you have cross-border offerings to accredited investors in different jurisdictions, right? The definition of accredited investors differ between the States, in London, in the UK, in Australia, and in Abu Dhabi, for instance, right? So how do you make sure that a particular product, securities, debt product, that's being offered in multiple jurisdictions comply with local rules and regulations, right? So this become a perfect test bed for the different regulators to say that we can make use of a compliance token on that front and offering it into different jurisdictions, respecting the local rules and regulations. The regulators can be fully assured that whatever products that come into my regime meet my rules and regulations. Wouldn't that be a cool product that subsequently has worldwide use? So things like that, things of that nature could be tested in the digital format. It doesn't require the regulators to be here, but this is a good platform for that, other than for the financial industry.
Well, that's music to my ears. We had the GDF, Chamber of Digital Commerce and IDAXA community, which is led by something called the Joint Working Group, and at the OECD in February, I believe. And I think regulators in GFIN have been taking quite a bit of time to think about how we get multi-jurisdictional sandboxes or testing up and running. But I think you potentially offer a solution for VASP-to-VASP testing for a lot of the technical service providers for the travel rule and R16 coming up. So I think we should probably pursue that in a separate webinar and see if that's realistic, because again, it's not particularly clear to, I think, folks in the community how that testing is going to get done with or without regulators.
Absolutely, and I do think that regulators need to participate in all this to really understand what's going on, some of the hardship and difficulties to overcome, and work alongside industry, right? So for instance, we have previous episode where we work on eKYC. And when it's just the industry working on eKYC, they face multiple challenges, including how do you transfer data, the issue of privacy, the issue of standards of KYC. If a client is onboarded by one particular financial institution, can I accept it? What's my liability? So all those require a regulator standing in between to give guidance, give his position, what is acceptable for industry standard to take root and for the industry benefit to come about.
Oh, indeed. I'm going to just focus on a few of the questions that are coming through, Richard. Abu Dhabi recently made some adjustments in its virtual asset supervision and licensing regime to bring it back into the fold of its traditional categories, and also adopted the terminology of virtual assets using a different category vocabulary, which is the FADF vocabulary. Could Mr. Teng shed some light on the motivation for doing so and how that aspect is going?
So there are sort of changes to that. I think part of the changes is to align ourselves to the FATF and the global terminology that's developing, right? This space is developing for the past 2-3 years. I do think that now the global standards are emerging. So we want to make sure that our standards are global, but some of the terminology used, there are better alignment to be achieved. So that's one area of work that we did. The other area of work is given that virtual assets have gained international credibility. That's not the conversation we are having 2 years back, right? There's a lot of questions. How do you first define it? Does it fall under the definition of security versus commodity, or is it some other form of assets? I think by and large now, we do have common agreement, common understanding. There's recognition globally, there's acknowledgement that virtual assets are here to stay. There is a certain playbook around how do you regulate them on the AML KYC front. So given that there's greater acceptance now, we do think that when we look through our rule book, most of the rules and regulations that we do apply to traditional assets are applicable to virtual assets as well, especially going forward. So that's why we bring about greater alignment of the two, and that's the motivation behind that.
And just flipping back to the innovation lab and some of the use cases, I've noticed that the FCA launched their digital sandbox or industry sandbox a couple of weeks ago. Chris Willard announced it, but they'll focus on COVID-19 measures. Are you seeing any use cases particularly focused on this perennial theme of getting money to people quicker, or industry players wanting to come together to use the digital lab for those sort of applications?
So our digital lab actually is still in the process of being built, right? And hopefully we can announce that very quickly when it is completed. FCA has announced an intention to look into instituting a digital lab as well. I think that is to be applauded. But we do see many trends. But given COVID-19, I do think that fintech globally is adjusting to the new norm. The different players that we are seeing in the past in our regulatory sandbox, we saw a lot of payment providers, a lot of remittance providers on that front, right? Those will be impacted by the reduced volume globally. We do see quite a lot of players in the wealth advisory space, right? Challenger banks. And again, those business models might be impacted because they can't quite pivot and can't quite grow as fast, given that AUM is being reduced. Challenger banks, especially if they continue to burn through cash and they can't raise cash quickly, they're going to have challenge implementing their business model and plan, right? But we do see new business model that's taking root quite quickly. You mentioned microfinancing, SME financing. That area will continue to grow, and we do see quite a fair bit of interest on that front. Areas of insurance, digitization, loan automation, eKYC, and the likes. All those areas are growth areas. So we're going to see much more. Virtual assets, we're seeing very robust interest on that front, on many different multiple fronts, along the different part of the value chain. Some just looking at custody, right? How do you bring about a proper institutional solution for custody of digital assets, for instance? So we're seeing different things coming through, but not necessarily the same as what we saw pre-COVID-19.
Well, I think that's a good point. And you need to really pay attention in markets like this. Clearly, we're in despair for some of the tragedy that's unfolding. But in the fintech sector, in my commercial world, but the buyout lists are starting to pop up on all of the fintechs that may likely be having problems that are acquisition targets. At the same time, we did a global hubs call out with crypto digital asset firms in March, and business is booming. And quite quietly as well, many institutional projects that are already in train and are particularly focused on digital assets, custody, issuing are still kicking away. So I think it's important to watch the space. And I just wanted to pick up one other dimension that you and I have been speaking about for a number of years. You know, I'm passionate about sustainable investment, sustainable finance. We're all big fans of the UN SDGs, where we both spent time. In fact, you were very kind to attend a red panel I was running there a few years ago on blockchain and SDGs. But have you focused given your focus in the investment market, on sustainable finance, number one, and two, do you see sustainable finance in any way being negatively impacted because of COVID-19 and you know, the need to really get the economy back up and running quick, or is sustainable something that people are going to think, you know, my goodness, this is now really much more important post-COVID for us to go ahead, you know, thinking and having sustainable finance at the forefront of our mind?
Absolutely. I do think that there's renewed emphasis, much greater importance placed on sustainable finance. And it's no longer only by investors, by the corporates, but by governments. Right? So we have a big Abu Dhabi Sustainable Finance Forum and agenda that we push, working closely with the different national agencies, the different exchanges, the regulators, to really build sustainability into our rule and regulation, to work very closely with the financial institutions. We do have an Abu Dhabi Sustainable Finance Declaration, where we get the big corporates to sign on to say that, you know, we are supportive of this, we are pushing financing into these areas, be it in terms of green bond. We're working with national institutions here. We're working with the state-owned enterprises to push out things like green real estate investment trusts, green bonds, trying to push the education front and awareness front. But it has taken a totally new dimension. I mean, if you look at ESG, environmental, social, governance, government are going to pay a lot more attention into economic sustainability and social sustainability, as well as environmental sustainability. Many have argued that if we have paid more attention to environment, to wildlife preservation, probably COVID-19 would have a reason in the first instance, because it jumped from bats to humans. Right? So there are arguments on that front. But government are looking at sustainability from an economic and social angle. How do you secure your supply chain? I think this COVID-19 episode has shown up supply chain disruption all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. So government are very concerned about things like food security, IT infrastructure and security, pharmaceutical healthcare security. Countries that can make their own masks, test kit, ventilators have come out much faster and better compared to the rest via this episode. Your defense, your critical manufacturing supply chain. I think all those are extremely important to government now. How do you bring a lot of those closer to home or back home? How do you promote your own local champion? If you look at what Bank of Japan has done, they have put funding into the marketplace to get the Japanese firm to bring supply chain back home, right? Because it's critical, especially in all those areas that I mentioned. And that is a renewed focus of sustainability as well, both economic, social, sustainability from each country's standpoint. I think we'll take some precedence.
I'll just get through a few more of the questions that are here. This harks back to the top of our conversation. Saudi's just announced a threefold increase to VAT rates as an austerity measure due to depressed oil prices and the wider economic slowdown. Whilst personal tax rises may be an unpopular move in the Middle East, do you expect governments to expect businesses to pay their way through more taxation?
I think it's an important question. It's happening globally. As I mentioned, government are looking at, on the one hand, I need to put enough money into the economy to make sure that it doesn't freeze us out in the short term. Over the long term, I need to secure my supply chain, right? And all those require escalated level of government spending over time. So it's not only governments in the Middle East region, but globally, right? Both the East as well as the West. Government are going to have a much higher escalated level of spending that's needed. And how do you fund that over time? Is through higher taxation, be it in terms of wealth tax, value-added tax, goods and consumer consumption tax, or greater taxation on technology companies that are key beneficiary coming out from this crisis. So you're going to see some of those trends globally because government need to keep that level of spending up for the reasons I mentioned just now.
Well, it's an interesting point. You're certainly going to focus on taxing the sectors that actually have revenue and
precisely.
Yes, exactly. And then there's another question. I like this one. Thank you, Richard and Lawrence. You know, what should a fintech entrepreneur who wants to set up in Abu Dhabi, you know, think of? Do you have any advice? And before Richard goes, my guidance is that the tax regime, the personal tax regime, certainly in Abu Dhabi, is fantastic. But it is a great question, Richard. I know that you constantly focused on attracting not just big businesses, investors, but you know, small entrepreneurs play a really big role in the whole UAE fintech scene. Can you give that you know, person asking that question what the real you know, impetus is and the drive is for entrepreneurs to come to Abu Dhabi?
My take is entrepreneurs always find their way on what is most needed in any economy, right? So you have to trust entrepreneurs with their instinct to sniff deals out, to find out what is really needed. So I do think that I leave the entrepreneurs to decide on what is best. But we pride ourselves as a hub, as a gateway into this fast-growing region, right? If you look at areas of financial inclusion, there's so much things that you can do here. We have a very good ecosystem that we have built, from the startup to adoption to deployment to working with financial institutions in terms of adopting all those technologies. We do have a very vibrant VC community here. We do have a very vibrant acceleration community here with Plug and Play and several others accelerator. So, and the champions locally, from the largest sovereign wealth funds, the Mubadala, Catalyst funds, the Abu Dhabi investment authorities, the action is here, and Abu Dhabi Investment Office has come up with a great scheme to really work with the industry that wants to make use of Abu Dhabi as a hub to tap all the regional exciting opportunities to be based here to get into those efforts and to help them grow locally. So we are here to support you. There are various programs available, including the Garden program that we have in Abu Dhabi. So if you are interested, do reach out to me or my colleagues. We'll be most happy to help and point you to the right direction.
Well, I would add to that for the listener and everyone listening, that if you're in financial services and in regulated financial services, you know, in my roles in not-for-profits for more than 5 years now, I've been benchmarking global regulators. And Richard has not led an award-winning regulator, you know, for not having a great team and a specific program in place. And so, Richard, I really do commend you, because I think what you and the team have done, I know you came out of MAS and were working with our friend Sotnendu Mohanty, and there's a very much a theme of being progressive as a regulator. But I think that your contribution really to the global regulatory landscape has been outstanding with the programs that you've delivered and the programs you continue to deliver, which is exactly why large digital players right through to small entrepreneurs in fintech are interested, you know, coming to you in Abu Dhabi, which I'm always telling people, I'm not sure if I've got this right, but I always look at Dubai as the sales and marketing engine of the UAE, but Abu Dhabi is where the governance and, you know, the regulatory decisions get made. So I hope I got that partially right without offending anyone. I have one last question for you before we hand over to Emma. I know that I think I was reading probably a couple of days ago, you've announced the ADG Fintech Festival, the Abu Dhabi Fintech Festival, the 24th to the 26th of November later this year. Can you tell us a bit about the planning of that? Are you expecting it to be a virtual festival, or are you expecting things might be back in you know, up and running by then?
So before I go there, I do think, thank you for those kind words. A lot of credit are not mine, belongs to the team. You know, we have a great fintech team here. Wailam, Barry, Brian, and many others. Some have left us, but they are all part of a team that we have been working together to drive this agenda. So it's not my credit, it's really the team's credit. So the FinTech Abu Dhabi is really into its 4th edition this year. Last year, we attracted close to 6,000 participants, which is the largest in the MENA region. We are excited. We have really keynote speakers globally, exciting agenda. And this year, what is even more exciting is we are partnering with the Central Bank of UAE to drive financial innovation, to drive transformation within the MENA FinTech sector. So they have many things that they wish to showcase as well, including some of the initiatives that embarked on regionally and globally, some blockchain initiative. We have our own initiative and we're super excited working with the central bank to curate this event. Hopefully, it's going to be a physical event, right? So we are still planning for a physical event between 24 and 26. If that could not take place, we have backup plans for it to be a virtual event.
Well, that's great. Now I've got this firmly in.
And of course, I'm looking forward to having you here.
My partner and I have attended, quite often before, but we look forward to bringing the GDF community this year.
Thank you. Thank you.
And that goes without saying. Before I hand over to Emma Joyce to take us out of this session, Richard Teng, CEO, ADGM Global Markets. What a pleasure it was to have you today, and thank you very much for spending the time with us on the Leaders Program.
Thanks, Lawrence. The pleasure is mine.
Emma?
Thank you so much to Richard and Lawrence for that extremely interesting discussion, and thank you to everyone for joining us for this Global Leaders Town Hall. We will have this webinar available for replay later. Our next Global Leaders Town Hall webinar is on the 19th of May, when we will be joined by Jason Hsu, Congressman in Taiwan. The conversation will focus on the impact and response to the coronavirus pandemic in Taiwan, what he sees as the next wave of technological innovation, and the blockchain ecosystem in Taiwan. Thank you again for joining us today, and goodbye.
Thank you, Emma, and listeners.
Thank you.